All right, so we're here with our 11th episode of the French Defense Speedrun series. We're playing against three different players, three different games in the rating range of 1700 up to 1800 in the rapid pool, the 10-0 pool on chess.com. Our first opponent is player with a bunch of numbers and a Z, rated 1776. They play e4, we go for our French defense. They play knight c3, we go for the move pawn to d5. They decide to exchange the pawns. We will see. Okay, they do decide to play the move pawn to d4. They are playing into now an exchange variation of the French defense through a little bit of a different move order than they would usually have. But when the knight's on c3 in the exchange variation of the French defense, I typically recommend playing the move pawn to c6. I like this idea of restricting the knight on c3. We keep the pawn on d5 well supported. The knight on c3 can't really move forward. Usually we would want to put our bishop on d6 pretty early on in these exchange French positions. However, if we did that right away, white would simply take the pawn. And even if we had the pawn protected and the bishop went to d6, white could maybe play knight to b5 to hit the bishop. So I generally like putting the pawn on c6 to kind of counteract the knight that's on the c3 square. And then I go bishop d6 here. Knight e7, castle, develop the light square bishop somewhere. And it's a pretty solid position. White is playing, I'd say, a little bit slowly, you could call it. h3 is not really a development move. It's a tinge bit slow here, but I don't think it's something we can immediately jump on and punish, so I am going to stick with the setup of knight to e7. This time, instead of being able to go to g4, I'm going to go to f5 instead. I'll probably castle the king first, but castle, bishop f5, bring the other knight in the game. Yeah, I think I'll probably just go ahead and castle the king first. And we will see what white does. If they castle themselves, I think I will just go ahead and develop the bishop. And it feels a bit like white's pieces are a little more passive in comparison to ours. Our bishops are definitely a bit more active than theirs are. I guess you could argue their knights are maybe a little bit better than ours, but we will get the knight developed to d7 and then to the f6 square pretty soon. So let's start with knight d7, I suppose. Don't see any reason not to continue developing the pieces off of the starting squares. Maybe the queen will go to c7, rook to e8, rook to d8. We could also have ideas of moving the knight, dropping the bishop back, and putting the queen in front of the bishop, trying to angle for some attacking chances over on the king side. Could be an interesting idea to consider. If white ever plays bishop to d3, we are generally happy to have these light square bishops traded off. White has a little bit of a problem developing their own dark square bishop. I guess they can play bishop to g5. But if they ever kind of zoom around or back up to the h4 followed by g3 squares, we've got that covered and can potentially trade and double white's pawns. So let's see how they decide to organize their pieces here. If they go bishop g5, I'll probably play queen to c7 to get away from the pin, and then maybe knight to g6 to kind of lock off the escape square of the bishop going back to h4. The knight getting to g6 or f5 in these types of positions is generally a good setup anyways, because if I can get the knight to the f4 square, that can also be relatively annoying for white. So they go bishop g5. I am going to go for queen c7 first, I believe. I could also play h6 first. That also looks pretty good, I will say. Maybe I should just do that first. Yeah, let's poke the bishop first, see what it does. I'm assuming he's going to go back to the h4 square. Now I will play queen to c7. And now it's a little bit awkward for white, because the bishop cannot go back to g3. I do have that square on g3 covered pretty well, especially because they played that move h3 earlier in the game. And now a move like knight to g6, or even pawn to g5. Both of these are relatively difficult for white to deal with, so he does end up taking the knight. I'm going to recapture. Now, one thing I do have to be careful about is that my bishop on e7 is undefended, so he could try some kind of bishop d3 type of move if he wanted to, and that would be something I have to be a little bit careful about. But if he does bishop d3, I think I'll take it. And if he moves the bishop anywhere else, I'll probably just move my bishop and save it. So there's nowhere that this bishop on e2 can go that really threatens anything that I can't deal with. Let's put it that way. So he moves the knight to h2, which I don't really feel like is a great location. I think I'll just go for bishop d6 to attack the knight. I assume he's going to play knight g4. Okay, he goes back to f3, which is already Not a great sign for him. I mean, he's moved the knight, back and forth 2 different times. So what are we going to do about this? How do we apply some pressure to white's position? I do think they're going to play bishop d3 pretty soon, and I'm not really sure if I have a fantastic way to discourage that from happening. So I think I'll just probably just improve the rook. Let's get on the open file. If they go bishop d3, I'm not entirely sure if I want to keep the bishop alive or just go for the trade. I would generally lean towards keeping the bishop pair alive, because usually you want to have a pair of bishops, and if you do have a pair of bishops like we do right now, our opponent does not have the pair of bishops. That's usually a bit of an advantage we can work with. Queen to d2 seems a little odd. I think I can simply play bishop f4 to poke the queen and send it right back to where it was. It's probably not the only good move, but looks reasonable to push the queen back to the d1 square. This also doesn't let the rooks get connected. Though I guess in hindsight, if I had, let's say improved the knight, they brought the rook over, then I could have trapped the queen, which would have been pretty good. But anyways, let's now go knight f6. And I want to put the knight on the e4 square. This is part of my idea. So yeah, knight to e4 is going to be pretty good. Doubling up the rooks on the e-file also looks pretty good. And we'll see how we can kind of counteract white's ideas in this setup. So he goes g3, and I think that this is going to get him into a lot of trouble, it looks like. So we do have the option of taking the pawn on g3. They take, we take with check. King moves to h1. If king goes to f1, bishop takes h3 is already checkmate, which is very bad news for them. So probably king goes to h1. I can either play bishop takes h3 or queen takes h3. Probably I would lean towards queen takes h3. But after queen takes h3, the knight goes to h2. How do I continue the attack there? It's not super obvious how I do that. It feels like it should be very good. I'm very much leaning towards sacrificing some kind of material here to get the attack going. We could also take on h3 first, and then if they take on f4, we take back. We are threatening moves like queen g4 to g2. And I think bishop f1, though, might defend the king relatively well. So how do we keep up the pressure is really the question here. How do we keep things going? I'm still leaning towards bishop takes g3. So take, queen takes, king h1. Can we do anything other than taking h3? If we take with the bishop on h3, rook to g1 hits the queen and kind of sends us backwards, which doesn't feel fantastic. And if we play queen takes, there's knight h2. Can I introduce a new piece in the attack? Can I play like knight e4 or knight g4? Knight g4 doesn't work because white covers that with their bishop and their queen. Knight e4 is maybe available, but white trades the pieces, blocks with the bishop, and I don't think that works out as well as we would like it to. So how do we do this? Take on g3, takes, queen takes, king h1. There is knight h5 or knight e4 right away, maybe? There's also bishop to e4. Maybe bishop to e4 is pretty good. So take on g3, pawn takes, queen takes, king h1. Maybe bishop to e4, kind of hoping that white takes the bishop and lets my knight come in because that looks quite dangerous for them. I think that could be very difficult for them to deal with. They don't have to take the bishop, though. They could play... what would they play? Take. They can't play rook g1 because then queen takes h3 is mate. Rook f1, I guess, is available. It really feels like we should be taking on g3 and attacking here, but I don't exactly see the follow-up, I will be quite honest with you. At the very least, we're getting three pawns for the piece, so this really can't be bad. Based on that, I think based on that at least, I am going to go for the sacrifice. I don't have it fully worked out, but I think that this is going to be good. So let's take with check. The king has to go to h1. King f1, bishop takes h3 is mate. So king h1 is mandatory. So the question is, do we take with check, take with the bishop, or advance the knight, or even maybe move the rook in? Like maybe rook e3 is also an idea to consider. I'm not 100% sure. Take here, knight blocks. How do we keep up the pressure there? Bishop e4, probably rook f1. But then I think I have a setup that works there. Yeah, so I want to eliminate the pawn, but I want to eliminate the pawn without the knight being able to block. And if I take with the pawn and the rook comes over, then the queen has to back up, and that doesn't feel fantastic. So I think I'm going to go for bishop e4. I don't know if this is the best move, to be quite honest with you, but I like the idea of pinning the knight. I want to take the pawn without the knight being able to block. So I think I'm going to do this. If the knight does take, then I will take back with my knight, is my idea. Threatening knight f2 check is at least a concern they have to be careful about. And after all of that calculation, white actually just walks into checkmate. Because the knight is pinned, now I can take on h3. The king has nowhere to go. The rook did just take away the escape square. And we get the win. So little bit anticlimactic. I wasn't expecting white to just walk right into. Let me X out of that. I wasn't expecting white to just walk right into the checkmate here. Quite honestly. But yeah, let's analyze the game real quickly. Let's do it with the game review. I think I'm going to try this out. I've generally done it without the game review, but let's turn on the game review and use it that way. All right, so we've got the game review here. Looks like we played at a 94.9 accuracy score, which is pretty good. Our opponent went with a 70.6. Let's go ahead and kind of analyze the game and see what we can learn from it. Maybe I'll have to adjust the recording here slightly. So let's make this a tinge bit bigger. Move this a little bit. Move that over. Okay, there we are. Okay, so let's go through it here. So they play e4, e6, knight c3, d5, pawns get traded. Does say that taking on d5 is a slight inaccuracy for white. I don't think it's really that big of a problem. They do get into this exchange variation. c6 is good. Knight f6 is good. Other moves are playable here as well. I like c6 because it restricts the knight from jumping forward and protects the pawn, as I said during the game. All of these moves look pretty solid for both players. We have a very slight advantage as black as the game progresses here, but nothing super major. White does end up trading off the bishop on e7. Plays knight h2. It looks like this is kind of their first, real mistake, you could call it, in this kind of situation. I go for the move bishop d6, targeting the knight. Knight goes right back. Went for rook to e8. Queen to d2. Here we just poke the queen with bishop f4. And you can definitely see at this point we're having an advantage. Computer says somewhere in the -1-ish range. It does look like their best move is to play bishop to d3 in this position, which is what I was kind of mentioning during the game. But they end up going for the move g3. And this is the big blunder that you could say that they make in the game. And taking the pawn on g3 is our brilliant move. It did take a little while to calculate and work through it, but it looks like it's very strong at the end of the day. Pawn takes, queen takes, king moves. Now this is where I'm really curious what the evaluation or what the move options look like here. Apparently, Stockfish kind of prefers taking on h3 first. I wasn't really so sure about that. I thought the knight would block. I suppose, okay, so we do have bishop check here. I thought maybe white would block with the bishop. Okay, this is the move I guess I was missing, it maybe in my calculation. So we can actually play this move knight to g4. taking advantage of both of white's pieces being pinned. Neither one of them can capture the knight. We are targeting their knight that's on the h2 square, and there's really not a great way for white to save both the knight and the bishop at the same time. If they try to use the queen to protect both, we can take the bishop first. The knight cannot take because it's pinned, and this would be game over. So, okay, I was missing that in the calculation. It looks like I had some of the right ideas of bishop e4 and getting the knight to g4, but kind of sequencing them in the correct order could have worked here with taking the pawn right away. I ended up playing bishop e4 first, which the computer also says is quite good. And then, okay, rook g1 was clearly the big walks right into checkmate type of mistake we took with mate. I thought white would play rook f1. That was at least one of the moves I was thinking about. I would have taken the pawn on h3 with check, which is good. Checked again on g3, and then brought the knight to g4. And yeah, it pretty much says white's done for here. We are threatening queen h2 since the knight's pinned. They have to eliminate the bishop. We take back. And white just has a hard time keeping everything held together. They can't move the rook without allowing knight f2 checkmate. If the knight moves off with f3, we have queen h2. The knight doesn't move, we're going to take the knight. And then at the very least, if we take the knight, we're not even down material, and we're still attacking at that point. So looks like we played a pretty solid game overall. Pretty happy with that one. Had one nice, brilliant move in the game, it looks like, and got a pretty good attack. So that's it for this first game. Let's go ahead and jump right into our second one. All right, we got our second game. Once again, playing our French defense. We're playing against Septi Andwi, raised 1716 from Indonesia. E4, E6, knight f3. We go for d5. Let's see what version of things our opponent goes for. They go for pawn to e5. So this could potentially transpose into an advanced variation of the French defense. With that in mind, I recommend going for the move pawn to c5. And if white does play pawn to d4, we take the pawn, which is what's happening here. And usually you would reach this position by a different move order. It would usually be with e4, e6, d4, d5, e5, c5, then knight f3. And we already know from previous episodes of the Speedrun series that the move knight f3 is not the best way of reacting to the c5 move that puts pressure on white's d4 pawn. The move that white should have here instead is pawn to c3 to reinforce the pawn, but based on their move order, they weren't really able to accomplish that. So I do recommend taking the pawn on d4 here. White has to recapture with the piece, and once they recapture with the piece, then the pawn on e5 becomes a little bit more of a liability in the grand scheme of things. If white had been able to play pawn to c3 to reinforce the d4 pawn, then they could recapture with the pawn, and then that keeps the pawn on e5 a bit more secure. So they take with the queen. We're going to play knight c6 to attack the queen as well as the pawn. White either needs to move the queen. Okay, they moved the queen here. They could have also played bishop b5 to pin the knight, but I don't think that really solves all of their problems in the grand scheme of things. Now, what we're going to do here is we're going to try to focus our efforts on attacking this e5 pawn, because this is kind of, I wouldn't really say an isolated pawn, but it's not easy for white to protect it with one of their friendly pawns, because they can't really play the move f4 without moving the knight off of the f3 square. And if they move the knight off of f3, then we'll take the pawn in the center. So what we can do here is a combination of moves. We can try to get our knight to g6, queen on c7. I'm going to start with the knight g6 maneuver first. We'll go knight e7, go to g6, hit the pawn, and we'll see how white decides to deal with that. So they play the move pawn to a3, which feels like a very slow move to me in this position. I don't really see the big idea behind it. I wasn't going to jump the knight to b4 right away or anything like that. So I think I'll just continue with knight g6 hitting the pawn. The other nice thing about the knight on g6 is it does also prevent the opponent from using the bishop to protect the pawn, because if they played bishop f4, I would take it. So they either need to play queen e2, or they need to play bishop b5. I was going to say this is the other way of protecting the pawn. The downside of this is that white is most likely going to need to capture the knight on c6 in order to deal with the pressure on their pawn. So the way I'm going to deal with that is I'm going to play the move bishop to d7. I'm breaking the pin, so now the knight's no longer pinned. And then if white had not taken the knight, I was threatening to take their pawn. So they do take my knight. Now, it's very important in these types of positions. You don't, generally speaking, you don't want to recapture with the bishop. you actually want to recapture with the pawn. And the idea is because you want to have another pawn being able to fight for control of the center. Even though it looks like the bishop on d7 is kind of blocked in and not very useful looking here, as soon as I do push the pawn up to c5, which we very well may do right now if we wanted to, then the bishop gets opened up, is what it comes down to. So do I play c5 or do I attack the pawn first? If I go queen c7, white can play queen e2 and guard the pawn. I don't think that's necessarily the end of the world. But I think I'm going to play c5 first. Maybe I'll get the chance to play bishop to b5 to stop white from castling if they don't castle quickly. Otherwise, I will play queen to c7, bishop to e7, castle, and take it from there. So because white is castled, if I do attack the pawn with queen c7, I think they'll just go rook e1 to protect it. So that doesn't really do a ton for me in the short run. So I think I'm just going to focus on developing now. I'll go bishop e7, castle the king, probably put a rook on the b file, since the pawn on b2 could end up being a little bit of a liability. And we'll take it from there. So white goes bishop e3. Now that the bishop is on e3, though, this does kind of block off the protection that white could have towards the pawn on e5. So now queen to c7 starts to look a little bit more appealing, because now I just don't see a way to guard the pawn. And now, actually, the more I'm looking at it, maybe queen to b8 is even better, because we attack e5 and b2 at the same time when the queen is on b8. That might actually be very strong here. Simply put, there might just be no way to protect both pawns. So, yeah, I think we're going to go for that. It looks very odd to put the queen on another back rank square, but the geometry works out pretty nicely, where we hit e5 and b2, and white just can't save both, as far as I can tell. They could try a move like pawn to b4, trying to counterattack the c-pawn. Okay, they go for queen to c2 to guard the b-pawn, but this doesn't really address the threat on the e5 pawn, so I think we can just go ahead and grab this. We're not worried about the move bishop f4 pinning the knight, because then we would be able to take the knight on f3 with check, and then we would take the bishop on f4. So, simply put, I think white is just down a pawn in this position, and once we castle the king and consolidate our material advantage, we're just going to be in very, very good shape with the extra pawn. And we also have the pair of bishops at the same time, which is nice. So white does take. We are going to recapture. Maybe we can even try a move like bishop d6 to attack on the king side in the near future. Definitely a possibility. But most likely I'm just going to castle next move, get the king safe, and take it from there. d4 is very close to trapping the bishop on e3, but white can trade the pawns and then play knight f3 to attack my queen and hit the pawn. So I'm just going to focus on castling. If the knight does move over to hit the queen, I will probably just swing over to h5 and keep the queen kind of somewhat around the opponent's king and give them some things they have to be a little bit careful about. So bishop d6 is an idea, and then maybe I can somehow try to eliminate the knight that's on the f3 square. So up a pawn, good pawn structure, more space, bishop pair. You know, many advantages accumulating here. And I think all of these things put together give us a very, very good position. So I am going to go for bishop d6, just to hint at the h2 pawn, keep the knight stuck where it is. I'm not entirely sure how I'm going to attack the knight. And okay, now that they've played h3, attacking the knight is not as beneficial, I guess you could say. How do we want to do things here? I'm thinking about pawn to e5, but I don't want to lose the d pawn, so that doesn't work out too well. Bishop to b5 hits the rook, but as soon as the rook moves over, I'm not sure if the bishop is doing a ton on that particular square. I think what I'll go for is I'm going to play the move pawn to a5. The idea behind pawn to a5 is I might want to kind of lock down this b2 pawn as a potential target in white's position. If I can, for example, play the move a4 and maybe bring one of the rooks over to attack the b pawn, then this is going to be another thing in white's position that they're kind of stuck babysitting. If I didn't play the move a5 and tried to attack the pawn right away, white might have been able to push the pawn up to b4. So a5 kind of controls the b4 square pretty well. And that's part of what we're looking at here. So white plays queen to d2. I think they might be trying to play bishop f4. I'm not 100% sure. Maybe they're still trying pawn to b4. Regardless of which one they're going for, I think I'm going to go for rook to b8 just to keep the queen stuck protecting the b2 pawn. So we're up material, but also trying to restrict the opponent's pieces from becoming active at the same time. The queen is kind of stuck babysitting the pawn. The knight was stuck babysitting the h2 pawn. The bishop on e3 doesn't really have that many places it can move to easily. And I can also throw in the moves bishop b5 or bishop a4 at the right time. So white plays rook to b1. I think they're really keen on playing b4, or at the very least, they're keeping the pawn protected. One way of putting pressure on this pawn is to put the rook on b3 and bring the other rook to b8. That would be one way of applying more pressure. I think what I'm going to start with first, though, is I'm going to play the move a4, and this really just stops the pawn on b2 from moving forward at all. And now the pawn is really just stuck on the b2 square. And if it's stuck on b2, then once again, one of white's pieces is going to be stuck babysitting the pawn once again. So white goes bishop f4, trying to trade pieces. I'm generally happy about the pieces being traded because I am ahead material. That being said, this particular trade of pieces is actually a little bit annoying because if I do make the trade, the queen can maybe start jumping into my half of the board, which is a little bit of a concern, I will say. And my queen feels a little bit misplaced in this position. So maybe in hindsight, another option that was good was to play the move queen f5 and stop the bishop from moving. But now we have to just kind of make do with what we've got. So my queen is feeling a little out of place. But we might have a good answer here. So actually, what I'm going to do, I'm going to trade these pieces. I'm going to play the move bishop to b5, attacking this rook. And I'm going to try to zigzag this bishop around to a better location, because it really wasn't doing a ton on the d7 square. I guess it is protecting the a4 pawn. Maybe that's one thing I have to be a bit careful about. But I do have an idea of maybe even playing bishop to d3 to hit this rook. And if the rook moves away, then I can maybe take the b2 pawn. That being said, I have to be a bit careful about my own queen safety here, which is a little bit annoying. Let's do... I think I'm still going to play bishop to d3. Yeah, I think I'm still going to go for this. Am I though? A little bit more annoying than I thought. If my queen was over on the queen side, that'd be great, but it is what it is. I can't complain given the circumstance. Okay, anyways, though, we're just going to make do with what we've got. Let's do... Okay, I'm going to go for bishop d3. I need to make a move. I only have 2 minutes on the clock. I'm going to attack the rook. I'm assuming the rook is going to move to d1 to hit the bishop. And then I think I'm going to play c4 is what I'm leaning towards. That would block off the queen from hitting the pawn, and I can hopefully take the pawn on b2 afterwards. I can also play queen f5, maybe to trade the queens. Is another idea. Okay, I think I'm going to do c4, though. c4 and work with what I've got. He plays knight to e5. He is attacking the bishop, but he's also aiming for the fork. The queen is not in danger of being trapped because I do have the h3 pawn I can capture, so that's not a concern right away. I think I can take the pawn on b2, or I can play queen to d3 to try to trade queens. Or, sorry, queen to f5 to try to trade queens. I think I'm going to take the pawn on b2. They're going to take my bishop, I assume. I'll recapture. And I'm going to try to figure out how to maneuver the queen into the game, because, again, my queen just feels very, very out of place. So they take, we take. They can take the a4 pawn or the d3 pawn. They decide to take on d3. Makes sense. The a4 pawn is actually pretty hard to guard, I will say. So that's a little bit concerning. I think what I'll do, though, is I'm going to go for the move queen to g6, attack this rook, and then maybe bring the queen down to c2 to try to keep up some pressure on white's position. So I'm still up my pawn, but I do have some things I have to be a little careful about. Okay, the rook moves backwards. I'm going to bring the queen down to c2, protect the pawn, hit the c3 pawn, and also continue tying the opponent's pieces down to protecting things. If the queen moves too far away, I'll take the pawn on f2. The main issue with my position now is that I need to get my rook on f8 in the game. I guess I can do that by playing rook to c8 and then trying to take the pawn off of c3 afterwards. But yeah, let's see what white decides to do here. If they go rook to c1, I think I'll play the move. I think I'm going to go for the move queen to d2 here. Try to trade the queens. And if they take the pawn, they do trade the queens. I was going to say, if they take the pawn on a4, then the pawn on f2 would be unprotected, and I could take the f2 pawn. Now, though, I'm very happy to get the queens off the board, because now I'm just up a pawn in the endgame, which is quite good. So let's do... I'm going to go for the move rook to d3, looking to target the pawn that's on a3. And yeah, I'm going to have to play a lot quicker at the end of the game here, but I am up a pawn, possibly winning a second pawn, depending on how white plays. They push. Okay, I'm going to grab this one. Now I'm going to block this one. And then I'll try to just walk the king over to scoop it up. That's my general game plan here. So if the rook moves to b1, I can just take the pawn. Otherwise, I'm going to walk over to keep white stuck protecting the pawn. Here I can play the move rook to b3 to offer a trade of rooks. Keep my opponent from jumping down to the 7th rank. And yeah, we're just going to be up 2 pawns, maybe even 3 pawns if we can get rid of the c pawn. So let's go there. Let's go here, offer a trade of rooks. If they avoid the trade, I'll push the pawn. They do decide to take. And yeah, here we're just going to be up a number of pawns. And I'm just going to try to push the d pawn down the board. That is the general idea here. Move the king up the board. Don't want to go there. Let's do this first. Try to push the pawns. Protect this. Yeah, probably I'll pause the... Oh, well, not pause, but I'll not be commentating as much for these last 10 seconds. I just want to get the moves on the board quick. I don't have increments, so I have to play pretty quickly just to not lose the game on time. All right, we get this check. Put the rook here. Move here. Check. Go behind this. Go here, threaten mate. Look to promote the pawn next. Check. Offer the trade of the rooks. And now we're just going to move the king, promote the pawn, and get the job done. I'll just pre-move the last couple of moves here. And we get the checkmate. Okay, so a little bit of a tight squeeze there at the end based on the time, but we do get the win nonetheless. We were up 2 pawns in the rook and pawn in game, so definitely was a winning position. Let's go ahead and move over to the game review once again. Okay, so in the game review here, looks like we played at an 88.8% accuracy. Generally a little lower than I would like to, But okay, that being said, we had 1 miss, 2 mistakes, 7 inaccuracies. So definitely a number of mistakes and kind of not fantastic moves happening in this game. But we'll go through it. We'll see what happened and where we can improve. So in the game, we begin with our French defense. We got a better position out of the opening, mainly because white had to recapture a d4 with a piece. We attacked the queen. We develop the knight, maneuver it to the g6 square, and you can already see that we're already having a much better position. It's already saying close to -1, and yeah, it's mainly because white has less protection on the e5 pawn than they would really like to have. We went bishop d7 to break the pin. We're now threatening to take the pawn in the center. White eliminated the knight, took back with the pawn, gained more space. It says this is an inaccuracy, which I'm a little surprised by. What does it say I should have done instead? Queen to c7, pawn to f6, queen to b8. I did queen to b8 later, but I guess we could play queen to c7 right away to attack the pawn. I thought about that during the game. I just thought that white would play queen e2 and protect it. I didn't really see... I didn't see why not to play c5. So, anyways, though, we went for c5. Our opponent castles. We developed. And it didn't like the move queen to b8, which I'm a little surprised by. In my mind, queen to b8 looks pretty good. We're just attacking both pawns. In the game, it worked out well because we just won the pawn. Apparently, white could have played the move pawn to b4 and counterattacked us, which was a move I mentioned during the game as a possibility. But we still have a better position as black anyways. We could take on e5 or take on b4, maybe take e5, and, even if white takes the pawn back, their pawn structure is pretty bad with all of the isolated pawns. Anyways, though, after queen to c2, we won the pawn. We're in very good shape here. Castled, moved the queen, lined up towards h2. Some slight inaccuracies in here, but nonetheless, we still have a very large advantage. Apparently, rook to b8 was not great. We should play something else instead. And then I think allowing this bishop f4 move became a little bit annoying in the game, but we still have a pretty substantial advantage. The c4 move is probably the first step in the wrong direction here. I thought this was a smart move to keep the bishop protected so we could take on b2 afterwards, but apparently after knight to e5, white is fighting back in the game. Looks like a better option would have been to play the move queen f5, and then black is much better here as well. So, anyways, we keep the bishop protected, take the pawn. We are still up 1 pawn, which is good. Queen to g6 was maybe not the best move, but neither was rook to d1. And then queen to c2 is apparently a miss. It says rook to a2 is the best move, but I would imagine that white would just take the pawn on a4. And now queen f6 is the only good, or like by far the best move. I guess you are threatening f2 and c3. And if white goes to d4, it looks like you take on a3 and you still have an extra pawn in the endgame. Sometimes a little bit hard to understand the computer's preference on some of these moves, I will say. To my mind, queen to c2 looked very reasonable. You protect the pawn, you hit c3. Apparently there's other moves that were better. So rook c1 was played, queen d2, queens got traded. c4 was a good move for my opponent. Rook to d3 is not the best. And then c5 apparently was the move that really tipped the scales back in my favor heavily, because I was able to pick up a second pawn for free. And as long as I keep the c pawn from advancing too far down the board, which is what I did, we eventually eliminated the c pawn. And then here in this rook and pawn in game, we're just up 2 pawns for free. We focus on pushing the d pawn down the board since that's our pass pawn, and that's ultimately how I eventually won the game. So the pawn eventually went down the board, and we eventually were able to promote one of the 2 pawns, then promoted the other one, and got the checkmate. So anyways, though, that's it for this game. Let's go ahead and get into our third one. All right, we got our third game, playing against Blockbuster23, rated 1789 from the United States. And we're playing our French defense, of course. They go for e4 followed by d4. We go e6 followed by d5. They play for an advanced variation. We play c5, striking at the center. Our previous opponent had played the move knight f3 through a little bit of a different move order. And then we took on d4, messed up their, well, I won't really say messed up their pawn structure, but weakened their e5 pawn, and were able to play around that. this opponent goes for the move pawn to f4, but I would pretty much treat the move pawn to f4 like any of the other moves that doesn't reinforce the d4 pawn with the c pawn. I'm still going to capture the pawn on d4, and then once the queen recaptures, I'm still going to play the move knight to c6. And this is still the general trend of things. If the opponent doesn't play pawn to c3, you take d4, you play knight c6, and it is going to be a little bit different here because the pawn is on f4 instead of the knight being on f3. This does mean that the e5 pawn is a little bit more secure than it normally would be. However, at the same time, there are some drawbacks to the pawn being on f4 instead of f2. Specifically, the e3 square, interestingly enough, is a little bit weakened. And also, there's potential checks towards the king because the f2 pawn is gone. Now, checking right away doesn't do anything. White would just play g3. What I am going to do here, though, is I'm going to play the move knight to e7. Yeah, let's go for knight to e7. There is also some possibility of playing queen a5 check, knight blocks, taking the bishop, knight takes, and then taking the queen. I don't think it works out exactly the way we would like it to, based on the calculation, but that is sometimes an idea to be at least aware of. So here white played knight f3. Now, I can pretty much force white to take this knight if I play the move pawn to a6 here, and it's definitely a move to consider. The question is, though, even if white does take the knight, do I want to recapture with the knight or recapture with the pawn? Generally speaking, I would prefer to recapture with the pawn, kind of similar to the second game that we just looked at, where we take with the pawn, play pawn to c5, and have pretty good control of the center. So if that's the case, I don't know if attacking the bishop is necessary right away. But I might also be thinking about this a little bit wrong. The more I think about it, I think I am going to go for a6, and if they take, I am still going to take with the pawn. But I do kind of want to encourage white to make the trade sooner rather than later, so that I can gain the bishop pair. Now, I'm not taking with the knight because I want to play knight f5, and I also want to play pawn to c5. So those are kind of the ideas behind not taking with the knight. Taking with the knight, I think, is fine, but then I have a little bit less control of the center because I don't have a c-pawn to help out with. So let's go knight f5. We're not going to g6 in this particular situation. Usually if the pawn on d4 is gone, we would play knight to g6. But because white has the pawn up on the f4 square, that means that the e5 pawn is really not going to be as much of a target as it usually would be. But what is going to be a potential target is going to be the e3 square, and in this case, the king. For example, I can go play the move bishop to c5 check right now. The king has to move over to h1. And we're very close to having a checkmating net that white has to be careful about. So if you imagine we got a couple of moves for free, let's say we could play h5, h4, and then it was our move as black. We would actually have a checkmate that we could go for in that position. We could play the move knight to g3 check. Pawn takes knight, pawn takes, opening up the h-file with check. The knight for white would have to block somewhere on the h-file, and then we would take the knight and deliver checkmate. So you might think, well, okay, why don't we play h5 and try to set that idea up? But then we would be forgetting about what white's threatening and what white's most recent move did, the move before king h1. When white played queen a4, they are threatening to take the pawn on c6, and that would be forking not only the king and the rook, but also the bishop at the same time. So we don't want to let that capture occur here. So to defend that, I'm going to go for the move bishop to, probably bishop to d7. You could make an argument for bishop to b7, maybe one day eyeing the king, but I think bishop to d7 is a little more solid in my opinion. But if white does let me, I am going to play h5, h4 and try to set up that attack. And it's not really a case of us playing for tricks or playing for traps or anything like that necessarily. I think it is just legitimately a good way of playing at the end of the day. So they hit the bishop. Let's retreat the bishop probably back to the b6 square. And now white also has to be a little bit careful about some of these discovered attacks, like maybe pawn to c5 is useful one day. They play pawn to c3. Okay, so this doesn't really make any threats. I am going to continue with the h5 idea. And this is a little bit of a ticking time bomb type of position. If I get to play h4, I think white's in huge trouble there. So the question is, how does white deal with that? I don't think it's so easy to do, quite honestly. They could play pawn to g3, and then if I play h4, they play pawn to g4, maybe, is one way of doing things. But the downside of pawn to g3 is it still weakens the king pretty considerably. So maybe if they push the pawn to g3, this diagonal is open. I might play pawn to c5, put the bishop on c6, and line up towards the king. That could be pretty dangerous. So you have to be able to adjust your attack on the fly depending on how the opponent plays. Yeah, but knight a3 doesn't do anything for me to worry about. I think after h4, I really don't see a great way for white to stop this knight g3, pawn takes, h-file, checkmate. I really don't think there's a way to stop it, quite honestly. I guess they could play knight to d4, but even then we're going to have a nice checkmating opportunity if they do that. So yeah, I really don't see a way of stopping it. Because the king is stuck. You can play h3, but then I would still check on g3, and then the king moves and take the rook, and now it's very, very bad. Yeah, here we are going to be able to execute this nice idea. Knight g3 check. The pawn has to take the knight. We recapture, open the h-file, and we get a very, very nice checkmate in this kind of position. White has to take the knight, so it's mandatory. And then they're eventually going to have to block with their knight on the h-file. You take the knight and you deliver the checkmate. So very nice finish to the game. I really don't think white could do much to stop it once they did get themselves into that position. And so, yeah, not really a whole lot extra to say here. I think they're just going to be getting mated in next move. So the biggest problem I think that white ran into in this particular game is, okay, they didn't have presiding. I think the biggest problem white ran into in this game was kind of the lack of counterplay that they had. They kind of allowed me to go for this attack without really doing anything for me to worry about in the meantime. But to be quite honest with you, I'm not actually 100% sure what they should have been doing in the meantime, because it really wasn't that easy to make very many threats. So we're going to move on over to the game review and check it out. All right, we got the game review set up here. So it looks like we played at a 90.5% accuracy. We had one brilliant move, which I'm going to assume is the knight g3 check at the end of the game. And we had one inaccuracy. And yeah, so let's go through it here. Our opponent played at 60.8, so our opponent had a bit of a rough game, it looks like. So as the game progressed, we play against the advanced variation. Our opponent goes for f4. We can already see that the computer is giving this as an inaccuracy. The best move, as I've mentioned before, is to play the move pawn to c3 to reinforce the center. This is what white should do. But as you see at these, even at this rating level of kind of the high 1700s, opponents are still making inaccuracies in very early parts of the game. We're only on move number 4, and our opponent's already making a move that's definitely not something that they should be going for. So we take the pawn. Apparently, there's other moves that are also good, but I like sticking to this heuristic of if they don't defend the d4 pawn with the c pawn, we take the pawn and play around that. So we take that, hit the queen. Bishop to b5 ends up not being so great. Knight to e7 is apparently not the best way of doing things. Maybe bishop to d7 is a slight preference. And then this would still be somewhat similar to the game anyways. So knight e7 seems fine, but computer says it's a slight inaccuracy. We hit the bishop. We take back with the b pawn, which is very important. Notice here that the computer also says that if you take back with the knight, it is still a better position for black, but it's not near as good as taking back with the pawn. And we saw how useful that the knight being on f5 later in the game was, rather than the knight being on c6. So he took with the pawn, hit the queen. Queen moved over. We gave a check. King went in the corner. And essentially, as I said here, it was like a bit of a ticking time bomb position, because if I got to play h5 followed by h4, I think that white is in big trouble. And you can see here that white's best move is to do something like pawn to c4. White really needs to create some counterplay for me to be a little bit concerned about. For instance, if I play h5 here, it looks like rook to d1 is the move that white should play, I would have probably just continued with h4. And yeah, now they can play the move h3 because there's no fork attacking the rook on f1. So this would have been the best type of defense for white to go for. It's still a position that's quite good for black, but at least here white's not losing any material. If I give the check, they go to h2, and black is maybe a little bit better, but the game goes on. So anyways, though, in the game, white didn't really create any of this counterplay. They played b4. You could argue that this makes counterplay, but it's really just a one-move threat. The bishop moves away. And then h5 is the top move, or one of the top moves according to the engine. And then h4 is the top move. And then, yeah, apparently white had to play knight g1 or g4. They had to make some very, very ugly-looking moves here. Knight c2 didn't deal with the threat. We check. This is the one that gets the brilliant mark here, which is very nice. And we ultimately get the win. No matter where the knight blocks, we will take the knight with the rook and deliver the checkmate. So yeah, very nice game to end on here with this episode. We were playing against players in the rating range of 1700 to 1800. Got a couple of nice games. Very nice attack here at the end. So that's going to be it for this particular episode. If you're wanting to see more episodes in this speedrun series, you can click on the playlist that is going to be here in the video off to the left side, and you can check that out. And so otherwise, I will see you in a future episode of the speedrun series. Hope you enjoy this one. Hope you have a good rest of the day. See you around.